Welcome to How to Turn Your Dissertation into a Book, an event brought to you by the Graduate Writing Lab. If you haven't done so, please sign in. This 1-hour panel will be followed by individual consultations, which will be held in this room, so please don't go anywhere. If you signed up for an individual consultation and if you got an email from me, your name should be listed. Also near the sign-in sheet there is a schedule for individual consultations. So please be sure to check your name and be here to meet an editor afterwards. All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 esteemed speakers. Jennifer Banks is executive editor at the Yale University Press. Jennifer is particularly interested in imaginative, well-written work that privileges subjects over disciplines in such areas as world religions, biography, biblical studies, Jewish studies, ethics, moral psychology, the psychology of religion, education, and children's literature. She's also interested in practical books and research and writing. Philip Leventhal is the editor of literary studies, film studies, and journalism at Columbia University Press. Before that, he worked in the marketing department at the Columbia University Press and at the Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago. Priya Nelson is associate editor at the University of Chicago Press, where she acquires new books and translations in history, anthropology, and current events. Themes of particular interest for her scholarly list include the history of ideas, world history, method, religion, ethnographic writing, economic anthropology, and social theory. Her fields of acquisition reflect her academic training at the University of Chicago, University of Texas, and Austin. Finally, Heather Gold is assistant editor here at Yale University Press, where she oversees books in religion and classics. She works in such fields as biblical studies, early Christianity, Middle Eastern studies, and Jewish studies. Heather is drawn to books that explore religions through various lenses, including literature, law, art, race, and culture. So first, Jennifer, Philip, and Priya will offer brief remarks on 3 issues that are of interest to most budding authors. First, Jennifer will speak about how to prepare a book manuscript. Philip will discuss how to think about picking a publisher. And Priya will offer advice as to how to approach a publisher. After their brief remarks, we'll begin the Q&A. I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the questions from the audience. So, Jennifer?
So this is a very hard question for me to answer because, the longer I work in publishing, the more I realize there's no formulas. And that's part of what makes our job so exciting, but also very challenging. And there really is not a formula about transforming a dissertation into a book. I'm going to offer a couple of rough guidelines, but I'll confess that they are somewhat exaggerated, and that dissertations take all kinds of forms, and a book can mean very different things to very different people. And I think depending on what kind of audience you're trying to reach with a book, what that transformation looks like is going to be very, very different. The 2 basic guidelines I'll offer, and again they're a little bit crude, but the first is that the dissertation is really being written for a handful of people. The book conceivably is being written for anyone who wants to pick it up. And I think that there's a range, some people have advisors who really are encouraging them to write this for a broader, to write the dissertation for the broader audience. And some people who are publishing their first book are writing for a very narrow sort of readership. So the degree of the transformation will be determined by those 2 things: where you're starting, where you're trying to land. But I think it's one of the biggest challenges people face when they're trying to make that transformation is to, going from writing for a group of people that you've been in dialogue with, sort of what their expectations are and what they're looking for, to just writing for this, audience of unidentified people. So that's something that has to be very carefully thought through. Who are you writing for and why? I think people who are on a kind of faculty path are often writing for professional reasons of their own. I think for publishers, we're not necessarily looking for someone who wants to publish a book to get tenure. We're looking for someone who wants to connect with some kind of readership and has an idea that they want to communicate with the world. It's not that we don't care about people's career aspirations and concerns, but I think we have a slightly different set of concerns. The other kind of crude guideline is, that a dissertation is where you show your mastery of a particular field or subject. And in a book, that's not really needed. Readers aren't coming looking for your mastery of the subject. They're looking for an argument or a narrative. And you're using, you're documenting sources in whatever way is, sort of needed or demanded by the material. But you're not having to show everything you've read, whether that's in the body of the text or even in the notes. So that's, I think, a big shift. It's very much related to the first thing I brought up. So those are two of the guidelines. But I will say that every book that I've gone through with this, it's been very different. And it typically does take years for people to do this. The books that I have published that have been, were originally dissertations, were several years in that transformation from dissertation to book. So one thing I'll just leave you with before I start talking is to kind of think through carefully for yourself if that is worth that investment of time. And one thing I do see sometimes is people who have a very narrow subject, who end up spending an inordinate amount of time perfecting this, and they produce a very beautiful, flawless manuscript that is still going to have a very limited readership and potential, in the market. And their time may have been better spent just, moderately revising this, publishing it in maybe some kind of existing dissertation series, and then working on that next book to really make a kind of dramatic jump between a dissertation-style writing and, a book proper. So, maybe with that.
Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, so selecting a press that you're interested in is a little bit more clear-cut. Each press, specializes in certain subject areas, so we don't publish in every different area. So, for instance, Columbia University Press doesn't publish in art history. And then within each subject that we do publish in, there's often a kind of subfield that we might work in. I think a lot of publishers want works, as Jennifer was suggesting, that sort of speak to a lot of different audiences. But then, presses will have, for instance, a focus in, let's say, Renaissance literature or modernist literature. So by investigating different publishers' websites and getting a sense of what they do, that should help narrow down where you should approach. You should also look for presses, I think, that publish in areas where your book has the potential to cross over. So, for instance, if you're doing a book in Chinese film, does this press have a list in both film studies and Asian studies? That gives the press the opportunity to market and promote your book to two different audiences, which is always both to the press's advantage and to your advantage as well. As you start to narrow down your thoughts about who you want to submit your manuscript to, one very sort of obvious thing is the books that you've been using for your work and the books that are on your bookshelf. What are the presses that are most represented there? Those are kinds of the places that you'll want to approach first, I think. You want to be part of a kind of conversation. I think when you look at lists, sometimes, particularly with monographs, you get a sense like, oh, I understand why this is a Yale book, or I understand why this is a Chicago book. There's a certain commonality in either approach or subject area. And your editor will, therefore, I think, be in a good position to get the right peer reviewers for your work, who can be very helpful in moving your manuscript along. I would talk to, your mentors, senior colleagues, and get their sense of their experience with different presses. Was the response time good from the editor? Was the copy editing and production process, did that go smoothly? And were those people in communication with you? Did they feel that their book was promoted adequately? If it was a scholarly book, did it go to the right conferences? Was it advertised in the right scholarly journals? And if it was a trade book, did they sort of understand what that necessitated? Were they able to kind of get that book out to a larger audience? Were they advertising in places like the New York Review of Books, where you can get a bigger trade audience? On a more practical level, think about the pricing of a book. I mean, I think there's now more commonality among the different presses on how we're pricing it. But some presses price their books, closer to $100 or $110. Some presses do in paperback right away more often than others. So if these things are important to you, that's another consideration to take into account. And then, finally, how will the press that you've selected affect, your tenure possibilities? I think some tenure committees are much more particular about publishing at certain presses in order to get tenure, and you should sort of find out from your senior colleagues, are there presses that are more preferable than others? And then finally, another sort of area of scholarly publishing to think about is, there's both the university presses, and then there's also the commercial scholarly presses, places like Palgrave and Bloomsbury and Routledge that aren't, affiliated directly with the university, but do publish a lot of, I think, particularly first books. So, that's another option to think about, but again, I would think about if there are any sort of tenure implications about that when you're approaching those presses.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah.
So I know that there's a lot of confusion, perhaps anxiety about how one should talk to an editor about your work, and there are certain, basic things of good etiquette that one can imagine pretty easily. But I maybe want to attack this question in an unusual way by talking about what makes a successful communication, whatever genre you're using to communicate, so whether it's face-to-face, email, a book proposal. And by successful, I don't mean that your work is accepted at every press that you approach. There are a lot of very, very smart people whose books are declined for various reasons. Even, deans of the social sciences and provosts get their books rejected sometimes. So it's a common fate, and you're in very good company. The kind of communication that is successful is one that allows the editor to make an informed decision about your project. And that's really crucial, and that's something that you can devote your time to and hope to see some returns on that investment. So what does an editor need to know? First, why must the book be written? In other words, what is the question, and what is the answer? You'd be very, very surprised by how many people I talk to who give me the impression that they know everything about their subject except why it might be interesting to somebody else. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean it with great sympathy and respect, because when you start to research a dissertation or when you're researching a book, it's kind of like free diving amid a sea of information. And at a certain point, you get so deep into your subject that the density of facts is so high, and you just start to sink. It really takes some concerted effort and presence of mind to kick back up to the surface and see what is interesting here. Why did I get interested in the subject in the first place? What might be exciting to other people? So what is the question? What are you saying? What are you answering? What's the answer to that question? You want to also convey that you have the ability to say it well. So in written communication, you want to pay some attention to the quality of your writing, the soundness of your argument, your ability to connect A to B. That's all very important. And also editors want to see a certain distinctive voice and a certain kind of originality. We're not looking for somebody who is sort of robotic in their execution of the methodology that they've learned throughout their graduate career. We want something who is well-trained, yes, has a certain rigor and thought, but then is adding something new and exciting and is being a bit creative.
don't look for just one brick that will fill a gap in a literature. That's not really what the presses that are represented here are doing. I mean, we're trying to do something that may reach an interdisciplinary audience that provides interesting answers to interesting questions. So it's not merely a performance, as Jennifer was saying, it's not a performance of mastery at this point. And then showing a sense of you know who the readership is, that can also be very, very important. In terms of approaching an editor, there's no sort of generic advice, and I also feel a bit suspicious of telling you that you must do such and such in the right order. But I would say perhaps there are a few things that you should not do. One of which is approach an editor without knowing what those answers are. So if you don't know what question you're asking in your book, if you don't know what the answer is or what the thesis is, sort of in broad outline, you don't want to just start sending information to an editor and saying, here's the chapter outline, here's everything that I've done in the past 10 years. You really want to have a sense of what that book is about and why it's exciting. So don't try too soon. Give it some time. As Philip said, you should know a bit about the press that you're approaching. Not all presses are the same, and you should have an idea of what they do and who the editor might be there who is working in your field. So. I don't know. We can talk more about it if there are specific questions, but those are some general thoughts.
Sure.
Could I just add one thing? One thing I forgot to mention is, when you're deciding on a press, how many different presses you should approach. And I think it's, a good idea to narrow it down a little bit. I mean, try and find the 2 or 3 presses that you really are interested in. And then it's okay to send those presses, proposal about your work. And in many cases, if they do decide to send it out, they'll ask for exclusivity so that they're the only press that are sending out for review. But I think at that initial stage, it's good to sort of get a sense from 2 or 3 different presses that you really want to work with.
Well, I was going to clarify that, right, because I think a lot of students feel that, they don't want to rub the editor the wrong way, and they would just send it to them, and then they won't hear for months. But you're saying that at the initial stage, it's okay to send it to a couple.
That's, I think every editor has a different policy. That would be my policy. And, if there's something, if there's a press that you really want to work with and you haven't heard from the editor, but you've heard from your second choice, I would then, write back to that editor and say, I'm very interested in publishing with your press. I have this other offer. Can you please let me know what your timeline is for a decision?
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I will ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. So let me start with a question that was posed by one of the participants. Here's what the person said. How much and in what way do I need to revise my dissertation in order to get it published? How much of my dissertation can I publish as articles? And feel free to answer if one of you or a couple of you want to answer it. Not everyone has to say something.
I started on the subject, so I do find it a hard question to answer. Like I said, most of the dissertations I've done have been several years, almost entirely rewritten. So they're taking the research that they've done, maybe the basic thesis, but almost entirely rewriting the actual book. That is not necessarily what's needed for every first book that's going to be published. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that first. You may want to have conversations and get a sense of who you're going to publish with. And then the second part of the question was just about how much to publish. There might be different answers to that here. I don't really mind if people are publishing articles, partly because I am assuming the book is going to be rewritten. I'm not usually publishing a book that has 4 chapters that were verbatim printed in different journals. They may have been published originally as articles, but in order for it to be part of a coherent book that reads like a book, and that probably is a little bit different from a very specialist readership that a particular journal might have. They have to be edited. Some people might say, more than half. You don't want all of the material out there. I think this has to do, again, with audience, because if you are publishing a general interest book. All the material maybe is available in kind of more specialist, journals, but you have rehauled the material. It's being presented in a very different way. It might not be as much of a concern, versus if you are publishing this book for a more specialist audience, and most of the material's already out there, then the publisher might start to feel like, then why would we invest several years in publishing this book if the material's already there? So I'd be curious what both of you have to say. I in my head, I kind of feel like once there's more than 40% of the book in articles, I might start getting a little bit nervous. I think I tend to be a little bit liberal here. I don't really mind. I don't want to limit someone's publishing, journal publishing track record early on.
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly. I mean, I would suggest 1 to 2 articles from your book, and again, with the assumption that it's going to undergo change. I mean, a standalone article is a very different thing than a chapter in a book. But I do like to see people have something published before they publish their book. I mean, I think particularly with first book authors, and particularly if it is more of sort of a monograph, we want the sense that this is an author who's already part of a larger conversation within their field. And I think articles are a really good way to do it. It helps kind of get your argument out there to a broader audience. Even within the field. And then if you do 2, you might want to consider 2 different types of journals. So again, using the example of Chinese cinema, you might want to do something in a journal related to film studies, and then a journal related to Asian studies to help reach those 2 readerships. And the other thing that I think, at least at Columbia, we're looking at more is, has this author published in more general interest publications as well? I mean, even if it is a scholarly kind of book, it's nice to see that on a CV. And there are places now like Los Angeles Review of Books or Public Books, I mean, in the humanities, that are writing about academic areas, but for a kind of broader audience. And it's nice to see when writers have that kind of reach as well.
On the question of how much you should revise your dissertation, I think that is very difficult to answer with any kind of generic advice. But one thing that I would strongly encourage everyone to do is go through the exercise of writing a book proposal, because it's this imaginative genre where you can sort of shape the book in your mind in a way that will guide you in terms of your revisions. If you just start digging in, going very deep into details and revising chapter by chapter, you still might, at the end of that process, not have the answers to the questions that you set out asking. So putting your work in conversation with other people, figuring out what's really exciting about your project, all of this can be done through writing a book proposal. And at that stage, you have something short to share with your friends, see what they think about it, tell you whether they think you're on the right track. It gives you something concrete to start circulating among people who you trust, and possibly even editors. So that, I think, is something that will help you answer that question in a way that is particular to your project. On the question of publishing, I agree. I think it's good to have 1 or 2 articles out there. It also helps you test the peer review process. So if you've never done that before, going through a peer review process with 1 article can be immensely instructive. Not only because you get to learn about the kind of comments that people will make on your dissertation project, but just familiarity with procedures and the way that timeline works, and the way that you think about revisions in light of anonymous reports.
Heather, do you want to add anything, or should I?
I think Priya's point about writing a proposal, I think that's really helpful. You might have a full manuscript, but you have to remember that editors are looking at dozens and dozens of manuscripts and proposals a week, and so we don't really have time, if we get a bunch of manuscripts in the mail, to sit down and read the whole thing. So even if you have the full manuscript, I think it is really important to write a proposal and send it, and that will answer all of those questions for us that you mentioned about who the audience is, why this press, why are you submitting it to us, and what are some other books out there that you see your book in dialogue with. And then that will help us assess whether we think this is something we would want to publish, and then go into reading the manuscript.
Thank you very much. My second question is, and then we'll open it up to the audience, is as someone who just submitted, one of the sort of nerve-wracking bits about the last part of it was, you know, the ProQuest issue. And there is a lot of sort of fear-mongering that, you know, we are encouraged to put our dissertations on ProQuest, and you can delay it by a year or 2 years, but ultimately most people don't really get their books out in 2 years. So the concern is that if your book is if your dissertation is available on ProQuest, that some editors might feel like a lot of your information is already out there, and if people can just access it for free, why should they pay for it? What are your thoughts on this issue? What would you recommend graduate students to do, or how to approach this issue? Think about it.
I'm not really aware of all the other concerns. I'm really only aware of the publishing concern, so I can only speak to that. So, you know, it might be a very good idea to do that. And in some cases, I think as a publisher, we'd probably encourage it, just because it's so hard for us to publish so many books that we would want them to be available. But for us to invest, you know, all the resources that go into publishing a book, you know, we can't do it for every dissertation proposal that we get. On the other hand, you know, if there's a book that is of interest to us and we know it's available for free already, there'd be some hesitation there. Again, it's a question of how much has this been changed. If it's a dissertation that went through all kinds of revisions into a book and the two really aren't the same things at all, then it wouldn't be a big concern. But if it's just, you know, kind of editing a few things out here and rewriting a couple sections here, I think there would be some concern on the press's part.
Yeah, I think I agree largely with that. I mean, I used to tell people that it's not a problem because, again, the dissertation will undergo substantial revisions. But, you know, again, this is something I would check with your senior colleagues and see if it affects, you know, tenure or anything like that in any way. I mean, I know at Columbia, at least in the literature department, they recommend embargoing it for a couple of years. And in part, I think it's just to, you know, your dissertation is, you know, again, it's written for, you know, 3 to 5 people, as many people on, you know, who are on your dissertation committee. And do you really want to sort of have it out in the public in that way before you've really had a chance to start thinking about how it's going to change in the book form, or before you have other articles out, for instance? So, you know, I think it's good to sort of have a little time when the dissertation is just yours and not sort of out in the world in that way.
This is a really interesting question, and I think there was a lot of anxiety about it maybe a few years ago. I sense that it sort of dissipated a bit because university presses in particular do spend a fair bit of time adding value to whatever's there. And the books that we choose to publish are ones that we see a kernel of promise in, and we want to support that project into book form. But certainly if you're looking at a press that's not going to invest that kind of time, where you are just hoping to get the book out as quickly as possible, that might be a concern. I also don't know what the downside of embargoing is, just for a couple of years if it's an option. I know the universities like to have a complete record of everybody's dissertation, but I don't see any long-term negative side to putting on an embargo. If you're at the stage where you're still finishing up the dissertation and you're able to make this decision early on in your postgraduate career, it's a good idea to save your great title for the book. Don't use the same title for the dissertation in the book. Make the table of contents more exciting. Don't just retain the structure and tweak a few things here and there. So think of the dissertation as the place where you can really, really geek out and put all of the things that you wanted to put in writing in the dissertation. And then you can cull, you know, what's the best material from each chapter, and make the book a better product and a leaner, tighter argument, more interestingly written, which has a better table of contents and a much better title. So those are some small things that you can do in order to distinguish the projects and in order to make a publisher more willing to take a look at it.
Okay, so if no one else has anything to add, we could open it up to Q&A. Pratima and Michelle both have microphones, and since we are recording this session, and the microphones are vital to your voices being properly recorded, we ask you to speak into the microphone and wait for one of them to give the microphone to you. You will not hear yourself, your voice will not be amplified, but don't worry, it is connected to the technology, so basically speaking to the microphone. All right. Anybody has any questions?
Thank you all so much. That was super informative. I have a question about the rote mechanics, or maybe better said, the etiquette of submitting to editors. Is it customary to just dump a manuscript on your desks and have it be responded to, or is there some more elaborate process that has to be undertaken? Thank you.
I was supposed to address this question and I didn't really adequately, so I feel responsible for answering. It's a good idea to find out who is the editor who's attending your disciplinary conferences. So if you're an anthropologist, find out who's going to AAA. If you're a historian, find out who's going to be at AHA. There may be multiple editors at a press going to those meetings who are covering different fields. So for example, Chicago has a history editor who does mostly American history. I do global history and less that's based in the US. So find out who the editors are. Send them an email several weeks before a conference saying, this is my book proposal. I'd really love to speak with you if you have time. Don't wait until a week before the conference, because at that point everybody's already booked up. And sometimes for the big disciplinary conferences, like anthropology is the biggest meeting that I go to, my schedule will be set a month in advance because there are so many people that I need to see. And certainly don't wait until the conference is already in progress. This is such a curious thing that often happens where I'll be checking my phone when somebody says, I'm here, can I meet you? That's really too late. And one thing that you want to keep in mind is that since most editors are fully booked at those conferences, it's not a good idea to just show up and start talking either, because it's sort of a stressful environment. Also, you don't want to make an uninformed decision about a book. So if you have somebody who comes and tells you something about the project, you don't really get a good sense of what it's about. You haven't read anything that's been presented in a more careful form. And so you don't want to start an interaction like that. It's best if you can plan it at least a bit. And then, as Philip was saying, it's a good idea just to get a sense from a couple of different people whether they're interested in the project or not. But if an editor asks you for exclusive consideration, you should grant that request, especially if they're going to send the manuscript out for review. So a blind double submission, and you don't want to sort of behind one editor's back submit and promise that you're giving exclusive consideration to both. That's not a good idea. Most of us understand all of the pressures that there are on early career academics. So if we're not able to respond quickly enough and give you a firm decision or a firm commitment, it's definitely okay to write and say, I'm facing a really strict timeline here. I'm on the job market. Do you have a sense of whether this is a good fit or not? That's perfectly okay. And I would just say the more honest and open communication, the better.
Priya, can I just clarify something you said?
Yeah.
So then, let's say for someone who is just starting the process, right? They email you a month in advance, you meet at the AAAs or AHA, and then should the person already have a book proposal at that point? So what happens when you meet at the AAAs? Is it like a 5-minute conversation that the student's going to have today? Or is it like a half an hour chunk of time where you've already read some of this stuff?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, generally, 5 minutes is not really enough to get a good sense of a project. So most editors that I know spend about half an hour, 45 minutes with each person that they're meeting. You may not get that meeting from every press that you submit to, and that's okay. Conversations can continue by email depending on how early on you are. Conversations can happen by email for quite a long period of time, or you can call up an editor on the phone. So yeah, it's about half an hour, 45 minutes. Generally, if you're at that stage where you're having that kind of long conversation, you do have at least a sense of what the project is about. And you hopefully may have already written the proposal.
But editors often will not want to take the proposals just because you'll go home with 30 proposals and you're sitting there on the plane thinking, what was I thinking, you know? I agree with all of that. I also have many projects, including first books that I've signed up, that I did not meet with people at conferences. They were just emails that came in out of the blue. And, you know, I think each publisher has submission guidelines on their websites, and you can basically follow those. And again, there's not really a real formula for how to do it. I think just using kind of basic guidelines of etiquette and trying to imagine yourself in someone else's shoes and being overwhelmed with lots of things coming in. And you know, the one thing I did want to add is that many of the first books I have signed up were recommended to me by other people, or they came in from that author with a note saying, you know, Dale Martin in the religion department at Yale suggested I get in touch with you. And you know, there are days I'm getting 20 submissions a day, working in different areas, and that's on top of all the other work I'm doing. So it's very easy to turn things down, as hard as it is emotionally. We're doing it all the time. It's most of the stuff that comes in does not get even sent out for review. So anything that can distinguish it and make the editor feel like they are obligated to spend a little time, maybe it's that kind of personal connection, or if you've met them somewhere, reminding them that you've had this conversation last year at a meeting, or you know, at this panel at Yale, or you know, their advisor suggested they get in touch with you. Any of those kinds of personal connections, I find, for me as an editor, make me sit up a little bit and feel like I have to give a little extra attention to this, because there's some sort of personal connection.
One other thing I should say is that when you do approach a press, you generally want to contact one editor first. If that editor is not the right person to review the project, she or he will circulate it among colleagues. So you can feel assured that if you have received a response from an editor, that represents the decision of the press. So you don't have to send it to multiple people. You don't want to receive a rejection from one editor and then send it to another. Usually that communication has happened. And if you don't know who to contact at a press, there's always an editorial director who their contact information is generally listed on the website. You can just say, I'm not sure who should be reviewing this. Maybe you could point me to the right person.
Thank you. Should we take another question? Is it okay? Yes.
Thank you all very much. I think I sort of have a two-part question. I was wondering, you talked about sort of the importance of revising, but I've also, in conversation with professors, been warned against holding on to the manuscript for too long and sort of doing too many revisions before it's gone out to readers. And so I was curious for your thoughts on that. And I guess more generally, if you could possibly walk us through sort of what the stages are once a manuscript has been sort of accepted first for readers, I suppose, and then the revision process, just to get a sense of kind of what the range of time might be for that. And I suppose what, in your minds, determines if you read a manuscript that you sort of think may need work but has promise, kind of what that looks like, I suppose, since I've sort of gotten the impression that books do come in, not absolutely finished, but somehow seem promising.
Yeah, I mean, the review process, the peer review process, is very sort of helpful and integral for that reason. And yeah, we don't really necessarily expect that a work will be perfect, and we are trying to find, something that has a lot of great promise, even if it's not quite there yet. But we do want to make sure, at least for myself, that it is far enough along that it won't sort of get bogged down too much in the peer review process. You don't want to have this sort of endless back and forth between the author and the readers, and then the faculty board at the press. So I mean, again, I think it's a hard thing to sort of quantify in any certain way, but I want sort of a fairly polished manuscript. But you're right. I mean, you don't want to sort of. There are people who just get too sort of obsessed with their dissertation, sort of endlessly revising, and there is a point where you sort of have to let go. In terms of how the process goes, at least at Columbia, I would say generally, I mean, once we decide to send something out for review, that process generally takes about, anywhere from about 3 to 4 months, or maybe 2 to 4 months, depending. And so what will happen is first it will be, sent to the peer reviewers. We generally give them about 4 to 6 weeks to give back the report. Sometimes they might miss that mark. And then after that, the author will have the opportunity to respond to the suggestions made by the peer reviewer. And that's a really important part, I think, of the process, and an editor will work with you on that. We really want a sense that this author has taken seriously the comments that have been made by the readers and sort of has a strategy now for how they're going to revise. I mean, it can be a difficult process, I think, for authors, and I often encourage them to take a day or two to sort of soak it all in. And then after that, we have an internal meeting, and essentially the purpose of that meeting is to decide, is this ready to go to our faculty board? Are the reports strong enough? Have they recommended offering a contract? And has the author responded well? And then it goes to our faculty board, and they are sort of the final arbiters to decide whether or not we should offer a contract for the project.
Do you want to?
So our process is very similar to that, with a couple differences. Mainly, our faculty board meeting happens a little bit later, so we will have our internal meeting after a project is reviewed and the author has responded. And at that point, we'll decide with all of our editors and all of the different department heads at the press whether we think the book is right for us and whether we feel that we can offer a contract. And if so, we would make sure that the reports are positive and that, or if there are some negative comments, that the author has responded adequately to them. And once the book is under contract and we feel that the manuscript is in good shape and the author has a good plan for revisions, then we would bring it to our faculty board, and that's kind of the last hurdle before we get the final manuscript that we look at, and that goes into copy editing and production.
Thanks, Heather.
I think generally I would want an author to take things as far as they possibly could and have it in the best possible shape. You don't want someone sending you something and saying, I have to do this and that, and I'm going to do more work later. Because you sort of have one shot with a house and with an editor, and you want to be able to make the best possible impression. Likely there will be further rounds of revision that you will go through after that point, but I would really try to get it, if you want to publish with a lot of the bigger university presses and a more distinguished press, if you're just trying to kind of move on to the next thing, get the book published as quickly as possible, that would be a different model.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next question? Eleanor, here.
First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. So I've also kind of two-part question, and the first part is a lot of the things that you said about how to give a book proposal are really surprisingly similar, seem to me, to the process of doing a postdoc proposal. Like, you need to have the why is important, who's your audience, and how you intend to revise your dissertation into the book. And so I wondered if you could say, do you prefer people who have actually gone through something like that? Like postdoc in a sense, and so therefore the time frame would be like 1 or 2 years at least of work in the dissertation to go from that to the book. And the other part is, do you recommend that people talk before to some people in your faculty board? So like I happen to know a little bit of the press I'd be interested in. Some people, some professors that are in similar things. Is it recommendable that to approach them first just to get an idea or not? I don't know. It's just very nerve-wracking process. Thank you.
It is a very nerve-wracking process, and I just want to offer perhaps one note of encouragement, which is there's so much conflicting information about publishing out there, and you may hear different things from different people. You may hear different things from one advisor rather than another. That's okay. In part, that reflects the sort of diverse environment in which we find ourselves, where there are many different kinds of publishers. Every editor works sort of differently. So it's definitely an anxiety-producing situation for a lot of good reasons. As one of our panelists mentioned before, we don't have a real stake in the career trajectory itself. We want our authors to be prominent in their field, and we want them to do well. But what we're really judging is the book itself, and a lot of us work with non-academics too. So the question of whether we prefer to receive something at a certain stage from a postdoc or an assistant professor, that doesn't matter really very much at all. If you're using that time productively, this goes back to the question of how much one should be revising. It's a question of the quality of the revision, not the quantity. So there is a danger of getting stuck in sort of an endless, fine-grained revision that happens over a number of years. And then at the end of the process, you might not even have a publishable book. So, spending a couple of months pausing, thinking about what's exciting, talking to your spouse, talking to your nephew, talking to your friend, whoever, to find out how you can communicate something that you've spent so many years of your life devoted to in a way that is understandable to somebody who's a non-specialist can be crucial, even if you're writing a specialist book. So take a couple of months, pause, think about it, have a plan for quality revisions, and then do it and get it done. So whatever that process is, whatever works for you is the right one.
I think too, sometimes reading the books that are just in your field can be a little misleading, particularly if they were published even 15 years ago. The field has changed a lot. So sometimes I think it's, if you're just writing a scholarly book, you're not trying to reach beyond a scholarly audience, but even thinking of the books in fields that are different than yours, and reading them and seeing what you can tolerate as a reader and what you can follow, and what would interest you in, if you're an anthropologist, what would interest you in literary studies. So that can be a useful exercise. And I think as another note of encouragement, for me, it doesn't really matter if someone just finished their PhD or if they are an incredibly distinguished professor at Harvard. I'm concerned with the book and what I think we're going to be able to do with the book. So in a way, publishing is more democratic, I think, than academia itself. And we do like to see that there have, you've gotten some awards, but it's a little bit different. I think it's much more focused on the actual product. And, to some degree, personality, what someone can bring to it, how they're going to breathe life into the project, how they're going to help us publish it, how they're going to help us promote it. So I think postdocs are great, but it's mainly because it gives the author time. It's not really about, what that signals to me necessarily.
I think she also had a question about faculty boards and contacting somebody.
Yeah, it can be helpful. I've had, I have a project that's going to be coming into me soon that was a dissertation here at Yale that was recommended to me by someone on our faculty board. It's the same as any kind of connection. They don't determine what we publish, but it could help, right?
Yeah, I think to think of them more as scholars in the field rather than necessarily members of the publication committee.
And if you already have a relationship with them, that makes sense. But if you're just reaching out to them out of the blue, that might not make sense. So I think if there's already a connection or a reason outside of just wanting the book published with the press they're affiliated with, that you're reaching out to them, then I think it makes sense.
I think the point about reading is such a crucial one, and reading across disciplines is great. Also try reading popular books. So if you're a historian, read some trade history and get a sense for how it's written, the way that a table of contents is organized or a thesis unfolds, the way that, for example, a journalist might discuss a conversation that she had is similar to the way an anthropologist might record a conversation that was had in the field. So getting this kind of sense of what people are reading in popular history or current events books might help you if you're in adjacent fields in the scholarly community.
Reading book reviews too. Book reviews, seeing what the New Republic is reviewing and what the New York Times Book Review. You might not be striving for that, but just to have some kind of awareness of what the environment is, I think is really valuable.
Thank you. So we have time for just one more question. Yes, Wendell.
Thank you all so much for this incredibly constructive panel. I was just wondering if perhaps you could speak to the reasons why a prospective author might pursue a contract with like some of the more prominent publishers in this country versus like Oxbridge publishers. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I tend to think of Oxford and Cambridge as, you know, in many ways very comparable to a lot of what we do. I mean, they're certainly bigger and they have other things that we don't do. But, you know, they both have editorial offices here in the United States, and their processes are fairly similar to what we do. I mean, I think perhaps, you know, one thing to think about is these are very large organizations, and sometimes, you know, you might not get the same kind of attention that you would at a smaller press where, you know, they're not dealing with so many different projects. So that kind of relationship might be a little bit different.
I think another helpful way of figuring that out is if you are going to a conference, walk into the book exhibit and look at the publishers' booths and see what's at the Oxford booth, you know, how do they publish their books versus Chicago or Columbia or Yale. That'll give you a sense of that. And then I think also, as Philip said earlier, figuring out what's important to you. So whether price point is important, that's something that's important to authors and changes very, very rapidly over the years. And, you know, whether having your book available as an open access ebook or in paperback first, you know, figuring out what's important to you and then looking at what different publishers do, because it is going to be different for every author and every book.
Thank you very much. So let me just ask one more question, and then we'll move on to individual consultations. So my final question for all panelists is, if you could only give a single piece of advice to a graduate student or a postdoctoral fellow hoping to publish his or her work, what would it be?
I always think the most important thing is just write the book that you are most passionate about and let the chips fall where they may. Because, you know, it's a very unpredictable process. You could write the most brilliant proposal that's very publishable, but there just isn't quite the right publisher or editor out there, and it seems to fall between cracks. Books come out and don't get the attention that people hope for, and you've invested years. You know, I think to just do the work that you feel most deeply inspired to do, and usually that translates into some sort of success. But you can't count on that success. So for you know, to feel like that time and energy that you've put into the project was something that you needed to do for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think what I would say is something that I think that Priya was suggesting as well. I mean, have a clear sense, and this is more practical, I mean, have a clear sense of what's at stake in your project, what you want to say, and to whom you want it to be said. And, you know, in terms of audience, I mean, there's no sort of right or wrong audience. I mean, there are great books that we publish that will reach 500 readers, and there are great books that we publish that will reach 5,000, and they both have a kind of value for the kind of publishing that we do.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to say is going to echo both of those comments. One of the really difficult things about being in a situation as an early scholar and trying to revise a book is that there is an obvious answer to why must my book be written. It's because there are job market concerns and there's tenure issues. So you have to bracket that in your mind and hold it there, somewhere in a confined space that doesn't overpower you in some kind of anxious and nervous state, and try to reconnect with why must the book be written from an intellectual standpoint, and what is the really crucial thing that's driving this process. I think everybody gets into academia because they're excited about ideas. There's a tremendous amount of pressure that dulls that excitement a bit. So recapturing a sense of wonder in your project, curiosity, finding what is still there. And frankly, if it's not still there, maybe you could get your dissertation out quickly and find something else, or cannibalize your dissertation and write articles. For some places where you're going to be teaching, that's also an acceptable way of finding a long-term position. So take a moment, think about how you want to spend the next few years of your life, and try to recapture a sense of excitement about it.
Yeah, I would say all of those things, but also I think it's really important to let your personality shine through, and show your passion and why you're writing this book and why you're devoting your career to this. Because at the end of the day, I think publishing is all about relationships, your relationship with your editor, your relationship with your reader. And I don't want just to read, I think someone used the word a robotic proposal or manuscript. I want to see who you are. And from the very first letter you write to me when you submit your proposal to once you have a finished book, I think I want to see who the author is and feel your presence when I'm reading your book.
Thank you all. This is amazing advice, and thank you for all the other really useful nuggets of advice. We would like to thank you all for participating.